How do I make sure that I'm not being overbearing? Then it's really important. And I think a lot of leaders struggle with this, moving through those different phases. They may move well from individual contributor to manager, but moving from manager to leader of leaders is tough because now the relationship is more about you're setting strategy. You're not executing. You're not in the day to day, and really understanding at each of the levels that you move through, what does that look like? And also talking to other leaders and paying attention, like, as I mentioned earlier in my career, kind of paying attention to what's happening in the water around you, really taking that opportunity to go through and say, hey, what do typical vice presidents do, right? What does that mean to manage directors versus managers now? And what type of boundaries should I be setting? How much should I be putting into understanding the organization?
This is the Workplace Therapist Show, and of course, I'm your host, Brandon Smith, and this is our first show back in the studio. So I'm really, really excited, and frankly, it's a little bit awkward because if you can see our layout, we've spaced it so we're 6 feet apart, which I guess is super important. So this is one of our leadership lesson shows, so we're going back to our leadership lessons with a particular focus on some of the big crucial conversations that we have in our careers, either we have with other people or that they have with us. So joining me for this awesome show today is my good friend, Kanyatta Walker. Kanyatta, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on your show. It's
Yes,
an honor.
really, really excited. So, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of your journey as a leader and kind of what ultimately kind of got you in this place and some of those pivot points along the way. But just so people kind of know a little bit who you are. So what's your, we'll start with today and then we'll back up.
Sure.
So what's your title today and where do you work?
So today, I actually am the vice president in our global product and technology group, and I'm responsible for digital transformation
For ADP.
for ADP across our internal organization from that perspective. So that's my role today.
And you say it that way because how long have you been in this role?
I've probably been in this role about 3 weeks now. I always joke I'm on my third role in 4 years. So there you go.
Wow. Okay. All right. So let's back up in time a little bit. So let's kind of go to the beginning of your career. What's kind of been your journey that ultimately kind of got you in this seat? What was kind of that first step that you took?
Sure. So I think one of the interesting things, in order to understand your career journey, it's where you're from and who you are. And so when I think about my career journey, I actually, which you may not know, I'm from Mississippi. So I grew up, born and raised in Greenville, Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta. And I decided early on in my career, when I was thinking about going to college, I had no clue what I wanted to do. So technology was not on the footprint. It was not something that I thought of, or actually, I didn't know what it was. And interestingly enough, I was a junior in high school, and I was talking to a recruiter about what career, et cetera, the whole ASVAB, joining the military. And one of the Marine recruiters told me, he said, hey, you've got really good math scores. You have some really good, potential. You could do just about anything except be an engineer. And that really gave me this curiosity.
He said except.
He said except. And because he said except, it really allowed me and opened the door. So part of who I am in my DNA and what you'll see throughout my career journey as we talk today is that you tell me I can't do something, I'm probably going to try to prove you wrong. And that whole tenacity. And so because he said except, I actually took the opportunity to learn more about what is engineering. And I was like, oh, being a math student actually makes me really good at this. So I attended the University of Southern Mississippi and software engineering program, and the rest is history. And I've really found that it has created, one, it was good at it, and two, it created a wonderful niche for me in my career that has set me on the path that I'm on today.
Okay, all right, so we already get our first big conversation. This guy says to you, except, and you're like, really?
Yeah.
Really? I'll show you, right? So that kind of got you on that path. So then you graduated with an engineering degree?
Yes.
And so then what was your first role?
Sure. So I graduated with an engineering degree, and that was in the 99 time frame. And so I was also very fortunate. I worked at Georgia Pacific as a co-op student. So not an intern, but literally from the time I was a sophomore, I was in their technology group. And so in 99, having experience in technology was a big deal. So I was recruited to Accenture directly out of college, came here to Atlanta from Mississippi, and had the opportunity to spend 13 years there of my career, which was probably a great solid foundation.
13 years. And what were your roles while you were at Accenture?
Sure. So I was a software developer. I was an architect. I did project program management. I was a delivery manager. So I had quite a few different types of roles, but all very progressive. So starting off with that software developer and team lead and managing people.
Was that for clients or was that internal for Accenture?
No, that was for clients. So at 25, it's funny. I remember that was my first time moving into management, and I think that's like 25, you're responsible for a group of people, over $12 million of work to deliver. And I had to actually interface and work directly with clients. I had to learn really quickly.
So in that, if you think back to that time at Accenture, you said 14 years?
Yes, 13.
13 years. Okay. And in the 13 years at Accenture, was there a particular pivot point where that was the hardest for you? Like, was it being like a manager for the first time, or was there a certain role that was the biggest stretch for you?
Sure. I think there were two career pivot points for me while I was there that was very important. And the first career point was being a manager. So I told you I was 25. And when you're 25, you sometimes come across as I'm a hot shot, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that what I started to notice, and it's good that I've always been conscious of people and how they're reacting around me, is people went from very, oh my gosh, that's really great, to what are you doing, right? And it really gave me an opportunity to pause and stop and take an opportunity to talk to some of these people who had been friends before and figure out what was going on. And I figured out the problem was me, and that I needed to do a major adjustment in how I managed and how I was going to lead people. And it really set a great foundation, because I learned a couple of things. I learned, one, everyone's different. You can't lead and you cannot manage everyone with the same lens. And I found that that was very important. I also learned that I had to really get to know and make sure that I was honoring in learning those unique individuals and styles, honoring what was important to them in their off life before I could really lead them in the role.
So you recognize everyone's different, but then you also had to learn a little more about them personally too.
Yes.
So they felt like you cared about them.
Right.
Okay. All right. Was it hard for you to do that?
No, it wasn't hard, but it was one of those pivot points. It was like, hold on, what are you doing? You've got to shift. And there was a great opportunity for me to pivot and shift in my career. I don't think it was hard. It was probably difficult going through those emotions and seeing people kind of give you the cold shoulder and not really understanding why or what you may have done or what's going on. But I think that the awesome part is that I had an opportunity, because you don't always get the opportunity when you're young and dumb to mess up and correct and turn it into a positive outcome. So I think that was the biggest differentiator, is being able to pause and pivot in a way that created positive change.
But there's also a subtle thing in that part of the story. You recognized something wasn't working, and then you reached out to people that you trusted and said, hey, something's not working.
Yeah.
Like what?
Yeah.
Help me out here.
I did.
And they said, yeah, it's you.
Essentially, yeah.
Which we all have those moments, right?
Right.
So you said there was another pivot point inside?
Well, the second pivot point was really around relationship building and networking, and building those genuine, authentic relationships. So another part of who I am, one of the things is my parents both were factory workers, right? And my grandparents, actually my grandfather owns or purchased, as an African-American man in Mississippi, 55 acres of land. And during that purchase, everything about our DNA says hard work, you wait your time, and then there's a harvest, right? If you think about the whole cultivation of crop.
Yeah.
And so when I think about my career early on, I was all about delivering, executing results, and oh wait, where's my harvest?
Oh, yeah. I totally get that.
And I really had to understand and learn is that there was a unique opportunity for me to not brag, but figure out how do I tactfully share the experiences that I have had, and also make sure that the right people knew what I was doing and what I was able to contribute and bring to the table.
Yeah. I once heard a client describe that kind of as like platforming, like you platforming your people so people know what they're doing, but also finding ways for people to recognize what you're doing.
And that was probably when you asked me before, was that tough? That was tough for me.
Yeah. Because people, naturally, because people resist that because it doesn't feel humble.
Right.
But it's really important.
It's extremely
because
important.
leaders are busy and they may not know what you're working on. It's not that they don't care. They just don't know.
And even when you think about it, sometimes when you're trying to move to that next level up or even your boss's level, there's that whole balance of like who takes credit for the work. How do I position myself, not necessarily to get in their way because I'm not a competition to my boss, but how do I position myself very strategically so that as I move my career forward, that I'm advancing and I'm not necessarily butting heads and trying to push my way unnaturally through the door.
Yeah, totally. So 13 years at Accenture. And then that 13 years ended. What happened? Where'd you go?
Sure. So I pivoted and then went over to a company called Amdocs, where I know have done some work there. And it was definitely through that networking and relationship building. I think when I moved over to Amdocs, I learned a lot about myself. And one of the things that I learned about myself was I really enjoyed consulting because I love to learn and do new things. And then I was kind of done with it. And it's funny because now that I'm at ADP, we actually sell a product from Marcus Buckingham called Stand Out. And I think we were actually giving it away for anyone on the audience who may have been interested. But that whole Stand Out product really profiles you and helps you to understand who you are and how you're wired. And so one of the things that I really learned is that, first, when I went to Amdocs after about a year, I figured, and I say this, tongue in cheek, that I figured that I had BS'd my way enough from that bachelor's of science and that I needed to get to pursue my master's degree. So I went back to Emory to do the MBA, and I was part of the executive MBA program. And while I was there, I really started to learn who I am. So through those Berkman assessments, I learned that I had a very high challenge score. So I needed to be challenged, and that sometimes the activities and things that people are doing, I need to be involved in what's new. I started to understand a little bit about myself as far as how do I stand out and how am I going to be uniquely position myself in the workplace.
Yeah, and so then, and you did that while you were at Amdocs.
Yes.
And so let's talk about both that MBA experience, but also Amdocs, because that kind of season was running together. Were there any particular conversations people had with you or particular conversations that you had to have with other people that were really formative?
I think during that time, not so much. I think I really did a good job of keeping my head under. I was learning their culture and really trying to understand the organization. So I focused on, again, executing, doing my job, and really, while I was there, I started to work on how do I build my external personal brand? How do I get involved, and what does it mean to step out of that comfort zone? I would probably call myself an introvert, even though no one would really agree with that thinks they know me, because I like being by myself in my cozy pajamas. I don't need to go to a networking event. I don't need to show up for dinner. I actually will cringe.
So quarantine is good.
Quarantine is good. I will actually cringe if you ask me to go to one of those things, and then I convince myself that it's really good for me. Yeah. So those types of things are things that I really was able to work on and really figure out how to pivot and do it in a way that was natural for me and not a way that was disgenuine.
So I have a question for you.
Yes.
At some point in your career, this happens to a lot of folks. It's a question I get asked a lot. And given that you've kind of self-described introvert, like to kind of do hard work and get recognized for it, there comes a point where we want to go ask for a raise.
Yeah.
Did you ever have that experience? Was there ever a time where you said, I felt like I need to ask for a raise?
Yes, I have had that experience.
Was that hard?
For me, yes. It was very hard the first time.
Well, okay. So when we come back from break,
Okay.
what I want to do is I want to explore that a little bit and see if there's any tips you might have for people listening who feel like they want to ask for a raise. They're not really sure how to go about doing that.
Okay. Sounds good.
So stay tuned. We're going to go to break. We'll be right back. Here's your coaching minute for the week, presented to you by the Leadership Foundry. So credibility, as we know, is super, super important. Let's say now you've gotten into a new job. You've either got a new boss or a new team, and you're trying to build credibility really, really quickly right out of the gate. One of the easiest ways to do that is focus on proactive communication. We all do the reactive communication stuff. People text us, IM us, email us, and we respond. Focus on proactive communication, particularly status updates. It's so simple and easy, but it's a great way to provide quick clarity into what you're working on and build credibility. And I find it to be the best way to enhance trust quickly with a new boss. So put on your calendar either every Friday or every Monday, typically the end or beginning of a week, to send to your boss what are maybe those 3 to 5 things you got accomplished during the week, and what are the 3 to 5 things that you're going to work on the next week. And you'll find after about 3 or 4 or 5 weeks of doing that with your new boss, that they'll say, hey, those were really great. You don't need to send those anymore. I really appreciate what you've been up to. So give it a try. It's a quick way to build credibility and enhance trust right out of the gate. Welcome back from break. Of course, this is the Workplace Therapist Show. And if you've been listening, which of course you have been, we've been on the journey with Kanyatta Walker. She's been talking about kind of her career path and some of the big conversations that have happened in her career or the ones that she had. And right before break, we were talking about that tricky conversation about asking for a raise. So talk to us about that. What was an experience you had when you decided, I think I want to ask for a raise?
So I've had that opportunity or experience several times in my career, believe it or not. I think one of the most notable ones was the first time I ever asked.
Yeah.
It was probably because I was nervous. And it was at that point where now in my career, I've had an opportunity to go to a lot of women's events, and I've spent a lot of time on negotiations from business school, and I've had some seasoning in how to have that question. And I remember my first time, I of course asked for advice. So that's the first step, ask people. Yeah. So that you can get a little help here. I asked for advice. I did some market research, and then I sat down. I created an outline. I had breakfast, I think, at that time and coffee with my manager, and I went through all the reasons why. I talked a little bit about my contributions and why I thought that I was maybe potentially not paid compared to market. And I kind of just left the conversation there. And I didn't get the raise, unfortunately, that very first time, but it was great. I felt really good about it. And I felt confident that I had at least asked and that I took the time to invest and have the conversation.
So if you could go back in time, would you have done it any differently? Or
no, I don't think I would have, because when I left that conversation, I felt really good about it, right? And I felt the biggest thing for me was like, you asked. Yeah. And now it was more around what's your value and what do you do about that because of that.
Yeah, and so the nice thing is, even though you didn't get it,
mm-hmm.
you still established how you saw yourself in their mind. Like, this is what I think I'm worth.
Exactly. It established my personal value and my personal worth.
Yeah. So would you give any advice to people who come to you now about that? Would you say have the conversation or?
Yeah, and believe it or not, people do come to me about that, and I think they should have the conversation because, again, right, I may look at it, and when you look at it from an organization perspective, there's always the bands, the numbers, and every company, right, and every organization, we want to make sure that people are being paid fairly. But sometimes, I'm not saying people are ever overlooked, because I would never do that intentionally, and hopefully no boss would ever do that intentionally. But I think you should have the conversation and ask, but come with facts and bring the results to the table.
Yeah, so be able to talk concretely about what you've delivered,
mm-hmm.
and maybe even market numbers if you have.
And market numbers if you have.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to your story.
Okay.
So we were Amdocs for a while, and then you made this pivot to ADP. Tell us a
Correct.
little bit about that.
Sure. So again, that was another relationship pivot, and it was actually one of my classmates out of business school from the time I spent at Emory who was taking on a new role there, and there was an opportunity that came up to run an operations organization, and he knew that they were looking for someone with technology background. He thought I'd be a good fit, and he made the recommendation, and it landed me on my first opportunity at ADP.
Wow. And so what? Tell us a little bit about your journey at ADP. What were some of the different roles you've had?
Sure. So I've had two different roles at this point prior to the one we talked about earlier at the introduction of your show. The first role was operations. So it was one of our business units, and it gave me an opportunity to really use that. When you talk about the combination of MBA versus undergrad, it really allowed me to create that perfect mix and use what I had learned because I was working in a traditional business setting, and because and leveraging my technology background, really getting an opportunity to zone in and say, hey, this is a business, not IT professionals, and really leveraging what does that organization need from an operations standpoint. How can we make them more efficient, and how can we deliver better to the clients?
And what was your title?
It was Vice President of Operations.
Okay. So at some point too, now you've got managers that report to you that have teams.
Directors.
So you're kind of leading other leaders.
Leader of leaders, yes.
Yeah. Was that difficult to make that pivot?
So I've always been very good when we think about crucial conversations of asking for help, especially when I don't know, or looking at a book or looking at resources. And one of the biggest things is, again, making that mental pivot. Now the people who work for me are people like me, potentially, right? So what I try to think about from my seat, what does a good boss look like? How do I make sure that I'm not being overbearing? Then it's really important, and I think a lot of leaders struggle with this, moving through those different phases. They may move well from individual contributor to manager, but moving from manager to leader of leaders is tough because now the relationship is more about you're setting strategy. You're not executing. You're not in the day-to-day.
Yeah.
And really understanding at each of the levels that you move through, what does that look like? And also talking to other leaders and paying attention, like as I mentioned earlier in my career, kind of paying attention to what's happening in the water around you, really taking that opportunity to go through and say, hey, what do typical vice presidents do, right? What does that mean to manage directors versus managers now? And what type of boundaries should I be setting? How much should I be putting into understanding the organization?
So what's a nugget? Like, what's one thing that you learned that's different about being a vice president?
Well, I won't say it's very different other than the level of people you're managing and being more strategic. The one thing is how I learn and the approach I take. That's very different now. So for example, I like to get into the details. I like to do ride-bys where I sit with someone on the floor or sit with an associate and understand what they're doing. The biggest differentiator is, as a manager or maybe even a director, you just go do it. Or now you say, hey, here's what I'm going to do. Here are my intentions, because people get weirded out by that, right? And I say, try to make my intentions very clear that, hey, it's here to learn, and I'm here to learn. I'm here to guide, and I'm really trying to understand your day-to-day. So I go in 100% listening.
Yeah.
And then before I make a decision or come back with any advice about, hey, we should do this, I'm all in. I may, in the back of my mind, already know or already have a strategy in mind of what should happen, but I can't really articulate that, and I cannot even justify that without understanding the experience that the associates are going through. So I really try to listen, and that's a huge difference.
You know, as you're talking, it reminded me of conversations I have with clients that will say, you know, I got promoted and all of a sudden people start treating me weird. And I'm still the same person, but when you come in with a certain title, it can freak people out.
Yeah.
So you have to be really, careful to calm them down, be unthreatening, listen a lot, so then you can, and explain why you're there so they don't worry.
And also you have to get out of the room sometimes. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. I used to be a consultant. So consultants are in the room, organizing, giving their ideas. We should do this, we should do that. And they're really planning, and they kind of posture a lot of ideas in the room. So now as a leader, if I go into a room and I start doing that, guess what happens? All right, that's what we're doing.
Yeah, everyone just gets quiet and starts yelling.
No, that's what we're doing. So even if they disagree or have a great point of view, then they start to automatically go. They automatically go with your answer becomes the answer. And I think when I was in business school, someone mentioned, and it was a book I read about transitioning. They mentioned a CEO came in, someone had designed a book cover, and they designed it in blue. And he said, "Oh, I wonder what it would look like in red." That was his comment. But what ended up happening is they redesigned it in red, and he was like, "Oh, I don't like the red. Go back to blue." And the recipient said, "No, you said red." And he was like, "No, I just had an idea." So you have to be very careful with the seat and saying what and distinguishing your ideas from reality. And I always have a phrase I try to tell my team. It's like, challenge me, right?
Yeah.
If I'm the smartest person in the room, I'm in the wrong room. So challenge me if I have an idea and I get very passionate and down a direction, but challenge me and respectfully, and we're cool. I'm going to listen, right? So, it's okay to pull my coattail.
Yeah. So I want to talk about, if we take ourselves to today,
Yeah.
right? So one of the big challenges that's going on in the workplace right now is how do you have some of the difficult conversations around race?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think about that? What are some ways, because you mentioned listening, and listening is so important. We can all do better at that.
Yep.
What are ways that we can have some of those difficult conversations about race and some of the events that are going on right now in our country?
So I think that's a great question, especially given where we are today, because I think that people are opening to listening. And I think the first step is being open and being willing to understand a perspective other than your own. And really sit and listen to the other person's point of view, and listen not to respond, but listen to understand. That's key, critical, and important. And then the second phase or step, I think, is once you're done listening, is really as you're trying to have some of these organizational conversations, is think about getting guided help, right? I'm a big fan of bringing in consultants or bringing in the right person into the room for those conversations. One example, and I think that ADP has done a tremendous job of, even before this situation, of having some of those difficult conversations, and they've brought in experts from Harvard to talk factually, not emotionally, about conscious and unconscious bias in the workplace to all of our leaders. And I think that type of conversation with that guidance of a professional is extremely helpful, but you first have to be open and willing to have the conversation and listen to understand the other person's point of view.
So at even like an individual one-on-one basis, I've been getting this question a lot the last couple of weeks. How do I start that conversation?
It's funny. So I think that go to a trusted source. I've had peers call me and say, "Hey, Kanyatta, I want to have this conversation, but how do I start?" And I always tell them, it's like, take an opportunity. And the biggest thing I tell people is check your circle, right? So my circle, and you kind of open the show and saying, my good friend Kanyatta, had we never spent any time together, you would not know who I am as an African-American woman, and you would not know anything about my journey or my story. But because you took that opportunity just to get to know me and spend time with someone who doesn't look like you, that's key and important. I think not enough in our circles, in our friend circles, not our work circles, our friend circles. Who are you having coffee with? Who are you having happy hour with? It's important to take some time to spend with those people to really understand those cultures.
Yeah. So not only spending time with people that are different, but then getting curious and asking about it and asking about how they see something.
Exactly, asking.
So, okay, so I've got another question that's been come up with me, it's come to me a bunch the last couple of weeks. Leaders will say, I want to talk about this, but I want to share my opinions. And I'm really cautious about that. And I say, it's probably not a good idea to share your opinion before you listen first.
I agree.
So just making time to kind of listen.
It goes back to the exact example that I mentioned of my style of leadership. When I go into a new team, because I've been very fortunate to transition multiple times, as we've talked about in my career, move to new things. I can't go in with the know-it-all, right? Yeah. I have to listen, because if I come in and with, I've got all this experience and I've worked at Accenture and I've worked here and this is how we do things, then it's automatically closed the door. So if you come in with opinions, before you hear what's happening,
Yeah.
then you're kind of already, and I take it back to a very basic business sense, because in that particular context, if I'm coming into an organization, especially to drive change, I cannot come in with my opinions before I listen to understand.
I think that's been a real big theme in your entire story
Yeah.
is just listening.
It's
Just
important.
listening. Yeah, really important. I had a conversation yesterday with an individual who kind of reached out to me. He's exploring going to business school, and he was talking about his boss, and he said his boss opened up kind of this all hands meeting around a lot of kind of the race relations and the George Floyd murder, and he opened it up very simply. He's just very sad, and they said they could tell, and he said, I just want to kind of open the floor for people to talk about this. And then he basically just facilitated it, and he said the conversations that came out of that were so deep and so rich because everyone got to kind of share their own experiences.
Yeah.
He didn't do anything more than just set a platform for people to open up.
That's mostly important, and I love that whole quote around listening to understand, because when you go to give your opinion, sometimes it could come across from the other person's perspective that you're discounting, right, their perspective, and you never want to come across as you're discounting or, oh well, that happens to everybody, right, because it will, but there's still those unique situations that will happen. And the important thing is remember I told you what I learned at 25, right, is I could not be an effective leader because if treating everyone the same with a peanut butter spread. I had some people who really cared about their pets who were diabetic. I had to learn to be empathetic to that. I had some people who cared about kids. I had some people, or a woman on my team who was a musician, and that's what she cared about. And I had to understand that and respect that difference. And I think about race relations, just like leadership and management. You have to listen and you have to understand, not to agree, but to respect the difference.
Yeah, I love that. Understanding so then you can respect the differences and seeking out those differences. Don't just assume that everyone's experience is the same as yours.
Exactly.
Which is part of that kind of unconscious bias. So we're getting close to the end of the show. And I would normally ask a life hack on how can we make our life a little more free from dysfunction.
Okay.
But today I'm going to ask it differently. I'm going to say, do you have a life hack for us on how we can have better conversations, more difficult conversations, any kind of tips or tricks?
Well, I think that when you're thinking about difficult conversations or any type of conversations that make you uncomfortable, I think it's first of all important to focus on the facts and really take an opportunity to take a step back and think about and anticipate sometimes responses, because there have been situations where it's like, oh, I didn't expect that person to respond in that way. So think about, what do you know about the person? What drives that person? So again, getting a little deeper in with the person that you know. And it's common now, we profile people. We look on social media. Who am I meeting with? What school did they go to? So really try to take what you know about a person and focus on the facts first, and really to make sure that as you're having those conversations, you're genuinely kind of keeping that narrow road, focusing on facts, but also listening and anticipating responses, because the more you can anticipate the response based on what you know, don't assume, but anticipate some things, then it can help you to figure out if the conversation goes this way, I can respond this way. If the conversation is going to go this way, I can respond this way. And then I also highly recommend, especially in the workplace, because I've done it many times, if you're not sure how a conversation is going to go, and especially if it's an employment conversation, talk to your HR rep.
Yeah. Yeah, seek out counsel, which is also
counseling.
a big theme in your career. You weren't afraid to ask someone for their advice.
Get the advice.
Whether it was on your management style or how to have a difficult conversation. Yeah, that's great. Kanyatta, this was absolutely great. Thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for the time.
If people want to learn more about you, more about ADP, where can they go?
Sure. So if they want to learn more about ADP, they should definitely go to adp.com.
That was pretty easy.
We do have lots of opportunities there, and there's wonderful work that's happening. Most people think about that company specifically as the age-old payroll company. They've been around 72 years, but we actually do everything from hire to retire. So when you think about the portfolio of a life cycle of employment, they do have services, or we have services that provide all of those different angles. Great place to go and check us out and learn more about our organization, because we service pretty much we pay 1 in 6 people in the United States. So it's a very 700,000 clients. So it's a very large organization. And then for me personally, LinkedIn is a great way to follow me and send me a connection request or reach out.
Super cool. Yeah, thank you. This is great. And thank you for listening and watching the show. Of course, if you're listening on iTunes, please rate, review the show. That helps us to gain more listeners, which is always a good thing. More people into kind of the tribe, making our workplaces healthier. And of course, you can check out theworkplacetherapist.com for additional resources to help you in whatever challenges you've got going on in the workplace. So until our next show, have a great week and an awesome life.